A very good evening, everyone. We start with a class on chronic limb ischemia. Today, I will be joined in this class by Dr. Shubhabrata Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee is a vascular surgeon, and today's class is intended for surgical postgraduate trainees who are going to go for a final examination for surgery. A chronic limb ischemia is an occasionally given examination, long case or a short case, whatever it may be. And there are many points on clinical examination and thereafter the management that needs a discussion. Particularly our brief discussion, which will be lasting for about an hour, will be mainly intended to remove the confusions, the treatment outlines, and the clinical points that are not to be missed, and the examination things that needs to be discussed. Now, today I'm lucky to have Dr. Shubhabrata Banerjee, who has been my colleague. And Dr. Banerjee will be taking us through what is the perspective of an opinion from a vascular surgeon, and how does a vascular surgeon think about an investigation to do in a case of a patient with a chronic limb ischemia. Now, so before we start the discussion with Dr. Banerjee, so I will take the next 5 minutes onto discussing about that. What are the main issues or the points that we in general surgery have to identify and remember whenever we deal with a chronic limb ischemia. Now, whenever I start talking about a chronic limb ischemia, I always remember about that there was a big river that was coming down from the mountain. And this big river, when it came down to the plains and then it went to the lands far away. So I have started to tell you a story today evening, is that when the river came down the plains and then the river came to the farthest of the villages down the plains, and thus the water could reach till the farthest of the lands in this. Now, there was a small house that was sitting on the end of this river, whereas there was another house that was sitting on end of this river. Now, during the summer times, when the water in the river would decrease, this house was happy because they still had some water. But in the summer times, when the water did decrease, this house was very unhappy because water would have been scarce. So with this simple analogy that I used to teach my undergraduate students, understand that the heart pumps the blood, and when it pumps the blood, it reaches the limbs with help of an arterial system. Now, when it reaches the limbs with the help of an arterial system, and it reaches so parallelly enough to the brain, the heart itself, the bowel, etc. What is important is that there is a long distance to travel from the heart to the limbs, and thus the main issue is about making the blood go in a pipe which has multiple branches. It has to fight with 120 millimeter of mercury. There will be other factors that includes the diet of the patient, the cholesterol levels in the blood, the amount of smoke or the cigarette smoke that he is taking by. But at the end of the day, all depends upon how much is the flow in the vessel. Now, the last vascular class that we had a discussion on something called as an acute limb ischemia. But today's discussion is something about a pipe that is bringing water to your house maybe. And this pipe is lined by 3 layers, like as you have seen any pipes that are lined by. The innermost pipe is the tunica intima, which is a single layer of endothelium and is very thin and usually doesn't have any group of diseases. Whereas the second layer of concern is something called as the tunica media, which does contain a sub-epithelial layer and a bit of connective tissues, particularly smooth muscles in the arterial wall. And definitely the last thing of concern is that there is a area, and then ultimately that there is something called as the adventitia, which is not that tough on the artery like you would have expected on a blood vessel. So in this picture, I hope you would have appreciated that there are three layers to talk about. And when you talk about the three layers, what is important is that the tunica intima, if breached, that means if you breach the tunica intima by any pathology or any endothelial injury, what is going to come out from this tunica are RBCs and platelets, which are going to come in contact with the next of the layers, which will be always a very rough layer, and that is the tunica media. So that means one among the major factors that is producing the activation of the platelets and thereafter the formation of a blood clot is an endothelial injury. Now, not only will an endothelial injury be important, there could have been other problems, like say, for example, some deposition of an atheroma or atherosclerotic plaque in this one. And when you talk about this atherosclerotic plaque, as in this one, it is now superseded by the layers and layers of platelets which are going to clog onto the surface, and thus effectively there is going to be a blood clot which will become endothelized or epithelized, whatever word you like to say. And as you can see, the lumen is gradually getting occluded. So when the lumen gets gradually occluded, the pathology, ladies and gentlemen, does not matter. What matters is either the pathology can be something in the wall like an atheroma, which ultimately will produce an overlying clot, which can have a layer-like appearance, and this layer-like appearance is that of the clot. Whereas on a parallel picture, you can also have an idiopathic inflammation of the vessel wall that happens in a disease group called as vasculitis. Particularly, remember that Berger's disease is a form of a medium and a small sized vasculitis. Now, so we have talked about this Berger's disease and etc. And to begin with, we also talked about an atherosclerosis. The reason about mentioning these two are because, particularly in an examination scenario, there are lots of confusions that students will have in this one. Now, whenever we have talked about these conditions, it doesn't matter whatever is the etiology. What it does matter is that in majority of the cases, there is going to be a thrombi that is going to form in the lumen as a result of an endothelial injury. Now, this thrombi, as you can see, is gradually choking the lumen, and more the lumen gets choked, less is the flow of the blood. Now, when less is the flow of the blood, what is very understandable is that if you understand that this is the limb of the patient, and this limb of the patient is being supplied by an artery, and this artery is going to give off branch to a muscle and branch to a muscle, and sometimes even branch to muscles in the gluteal region. So it is very easy to understand that if you have a clot high up in the iliac region, the patient will come obviously with a cramp in the buttock region, and thus patients with an aortoiliac occlusion present with a pain or a cramp sensation in this region. A superficial femoral or a common femoral will be a better answer, will be a cramp in the thigh region, and a popliteal will present with an ischemic part to the calf region. Now, this brings us to a very straightforward point around what is exactly a form of an ischemia. And remember that the word ischemia is technically a reversible term. That means in pathology, if you have read that, this is a reversible form of a tissue hypoxia, which should be corrected when there is a reversal of the blood flow. Now, that means that the cells which are expected to have a good amount of oxygen, and thus their metabolism was expected to be aerobic. Now, in a decreased state of oxygen, they go for some amount of an anaerobic metabolism, and thus, but still do survive. So if they still do survive, the major important point is, this is a point that you need to identify an ischemia. Ischemia can lead to something called as an infarction. That means an irreversible procedure. And infarction can lead to something called as a gangrene, or technically enough, if gangrene is a putrefaction with a bacteria, the better word then would have been necrosis, which means a macroscopic evidence of a tissue death. Now, in between infarction and necrosis, there is a gray zone where some amount of tissues will be dying and some amount of tissues will be recovering, is something called as a pre-gangrene, which means that there is no gross evidence of necrosis, but there are evidences of infarction in the tissues in some places, which is irreversible. Ischemia is always present, and a state of pre-gangrene means that this patient is going in for an impending gangrene or a necrosis in the limb, but still there is time for you to identify ischemia to the tissues and intervene. Now, if you understand with this analogy and this logic, a patient with a chronic limb ischemia will present usually with an claudication, which means a pain, and we'll discuss about this in a minute. Apart from claudication, due to the permanent cessation of the blood flow, you will have gangrene in the tissue, which in a case of a chronic limb ischemia is usually, remember, a dry gangrene. Though the name is dry, but remember there is a subtle form of an infection that is always lurking in the mind. Patients who have diabetes, again, they are going to have it much difficult. And in a case of a rather than dry, some patients may have some moist gangrene, some people say gas gangrene, some people say a wet form of an gangrene. So there are many names to the same condition. But what is important is that means a dry gangrene versus a wet gangrene or a gas gangrene, etc., may be related with the pathology rather than this. So with this background in which that we have known that the tissues, particularly the lower limbs, can be subjected to an occlusion of the artery. So if this is the artery that is supplying the lower limb, from the aortic bifurcation down, so this is the common femoral, and this becoming popliteal, and then there is a trifurcation. So this is the external iliac, internal iliac, common femoral, and then it breaks up to form the trifurcation. You have the profunda femoris at one point, and you have the inguinal ligament. So ladies and gentlemen, with this point and with this background that a block in this arterial system is either going to cause pain symptoms like claudication and wrist pain, and end organ problems like gangrene, which means that the tissues are dead. So with this background, I have with me Dr. Shubhabrata Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee is a vascular surgeon, and the next around 45 minutes, we will be going through Dr. Banerjee's experiences, and we'll having a discussion around what is a vascular surgeon's approach to develop or managing a limb ischemia. Okay, Shubho, are you there? Yeah.
Yes, sir. So I'll just interrupt you with this diagram itself to take it on from here. Like you said, the story of the river, this is, I think, the direct circuit that we are talking about. The aorta going into the iliacs, into the femoral, into the popliteal is the direct circuit we are talking about. Once you're looking at a vascular case, we have to have a gross idea about the collaterals as well, because a lot of the symptoms and a lot of the disease progression will be only understood if you have a basic idea of the collaterals. So if you're talking of the lower limb only, then we need to understand that from the internal iliac, there are multiple collaterals which do communicate with the profunda. From the profunda, there are multiple collaterals through the muscular veins of the thigh, which do communicate with the anastomosis around the knee. And below the knee, again, there are multiple choke or interconnecting vessels amongst each other. Now, likewise, in human physiology elsewhere in the body, when the normal pathway is patent, these aberrant pathways or these collaterals do not have a major role. They are mostly perfusing their own muscular end organs. That's about it. They're not really interconnected. When the main circuit is blocked, let's say if you're having a femoral block below the thigh, below the common femoral artery, usually it is seen that if we have a chronic block over a period of time, on a single level, the patient will usually manifest themselves as claudicants. They will not come usually with ulcers or critical limb ischemia or tissue loss. This is basically because then the profunda takes over. it becomes hypertrophy. The collaterals take over. There's a reformation of the popliteal artery downstairs somewhere, and the distal perfusion is maintained. But in doing so, much of the blood vessels from the thigh muscles are gradually, starved off the lower thigh and the calf muscle. And therein you see that femoral blocks will come with thigh and calf claudication, mostly calf claudication. The similar thing happens if there is an iliac occlusion. The internal iliac hypertrophies, it has to deliver the blood to the lower limb through the collateral, through the femoral artery, and the buttock muscles are gradually starved and they come to you with buttock and upper thigh claudication. So just to keep in mind that if you have a single level of chronic disease, the collaterals pick up, and if you have a distal fair vessel, then usually you will be seeing a claudicating patient rather than a patient with ulcer or tissue loss or gangrene.
Okay,
so I think that's about it for a fair understanding.
So that's a very important point that I think that you made it so well is something when you talked about a collateral. Now, if you have talked about a collateral and we have talked about the various pathologies, because this is an obvious question, particularly in an examination scenario in India and the rest of the world maybe, in which that examiners and for an examination point of view will ask sometimes the obvious question that what is the etiology? Is it an atherosclerosis or is it an Burgess disease? And believe me that I think this question should have come much later on, but yes, in an examination setup, this question does come sometimes much before than you expected. Okay, so now as a vascular surgeon, what are your points that goes in favor of an atherosclerosis, or when do you think the etiology is probably due to an atherosclerosis but not a Burgess disease, or in a Burgess disease, what are the points that you go by?
Well, for everyone in today's day, atherosclerosis is far, far more common than Burgess disease. Burgess disease is a name that is given to a very specific type of a vasculitis, and there are specific criteria to it. So if I just take one of the criteria, the Shionois criteria, there are other like the Olin's criteria, few European criteria, but if I just pick up the Shionois criteria, which is far more often discussed, you will find that it has got specific criteria. The onset of the disease has to be lesser than 45 years of age. The patient has to be a smoker. The patient has to have medium and small vessel disease, nothing to do with the large vessel. He has to have either a venous involvement or an upper limb involvement. And most importantly, the last point, that he has to have all other atherosclerosis risk factor absent. Namely, he should not have diabetes as a contributory cause, nor hyperlipidemia, nor hypertension, and his age has to be lesser than 45. Now, if you just go by these criteria, you have mostly knocked off most of your patients. If you just come to the other side, atherosclerosis will be precipitated by age, usually more than 50, though there are accelerated atherosclerosis, young age atherosclerosis. These days, it has no age almost, but let's keep it usually around 50. It will be mostly a major vessel disease. It will affect the aorta, the iliacs, the femorals, and not only the small vessel disease. It is very, very typical of an atherosclerosis to start off with a bifurcational disease sometimes, the aortic bifurcation, the femoral bifurcation, the popliteal bifurcation. And it will be, if not always, but it is very common to have it bilateral because atherosclerotic is a systemic disease, so it will affect both the lower limbs. There will be some of the other risk factors, be it age, diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia in these patients. And you will more often find that they have a stigma of atherosclerosis, or the other systemic effects like a history of a cerebrovascular accident or transient ischemic attack, or a history of a coronary episode in the past, or for that matter, a family history also suggestive of atherosclerosis. So when you combine today's lifestyle, the risk factors, the pattern of disease, Burgess should not come to the mind first, unless it is very typical of a Burgess.
Okay, so this is a very important point. I think that for all the students who are listening to this, remember that what Dr. Banerjee has said is exactly the thing that you need to understand. A Buerger's disease technically is a uncommon, if not a rare disease. So please don't diagnose a Buerger's disease in every chronic limb ischemia that you have. To technically stamp it off as a Buerger's disease, you need to fulfill criteria, of which, apart from the Olin's, Adams, the most favorite one is something called Shearno's criteria. Okay, but Shubha, there is an important term that is called as presenile atherosclerosis. What exactly is this, and how does it differ from an Buerger's disease?
Presenile atherosclerosis, the pathophysiology, I won't have much of great of an idea, but all that I can contribute is that this will be accelerated atherosclerosis at a younger age.
Okay, so maybe the better terminology in this modern era would have been an accelerated atherosclerosis, right?
Yeah.
Now,
They will present
so
at a younger age, not like the 50 peak that we think of otherwise.
okay, right enough. So, what exactly is the etiology in this group? Diabetes, smoking. What do you feel is the etiology in this group?
There are specific etiologies to this. One is the modifiable, the other is non-modifiable, and the family history. If you have a family history, a history of early cardiac deaths in the family or cardiac events in the family, the major cardiac events such as a CV or an AMI, combined to that, if you are an uncontrolled diabetic, hypertensive, smoker, and dyslipidemic, especially with LDL levels very high, if you're having a dyslipidemic syndrome, and obviously stress combined to this.
Okay, so that's a good point made. Now, so if you have talked about an accelerated atherosclerosis versus this, now as we have been talking about, now it can be an atherosclerosis, it can be a Buerger's disease, it can be presenile, everything. So basically that means all of them will effectively lead to the lumen that is getting clotted, or the lumen that exactly undergoes a state of a occlusion. Now we are not talking of a Raynaud's phenomenon in this one. Now, Shubha, in this one, as we have said that majority of the patients are going to present with claudication.
Right.
Now, in this one, this is an obvious question that is always asked in examination, and particularly as a vascular surgeon. What exactly are the history points that you note from a patient who is now presenting with a rest pain?
To start off with age, then the elaboration of the pain. Now, if you are speaking of a person who is having a rest pain, I expect him to be in distress. I expect him to want to keep the leg lying down rather than on the bed. He would be comfortable in a warm environment. And if you start asking him questions, he would say that, you know, maybe it's been few months, if not close to a year, that his pain had started. Initially, he would have a thigh or a calf pain, which would be crampy in nature. And this would have started by walking. If you ask him closely, he will say that initially he would have walked maybe some distance. Let's say if he would have walked 500 meters or a kilometers or something like that, according to his daily habits. But gradually that has kept coming down, and that has consistently kept coming down. So, I mean, maybe 12 months back, he was walking a kilometer. Now his pain starts after walking 6 months back after walking 500 meters. Last 3 weeks, maybe just the toilet. But he would say that, you know, initially when I would rest down, it would be relieved and I could walk again. Now the distance has come down. I rest and still I have pain. And for the last month, since the last month, I'm having pain all the time. I do not walk, so I don't understand if my calf is paining or not, but my foot and the terminal parts are absolutely distressful. I do not want to keep it on the bed. I cannot sleep with that on the bed. I want to keep it hanging. I need blankets in this winter. And, you know, I just cannot get over the pain with the analgesic or the paracetamols or even the higher analgesic that has been prescribed for me over the last 2 weeks by my doctor. So this would be, mostly a history that he would give.
Okay. Now, so now I feel that by this time you have stressed upon the point that the patient is going to develop a decreasing claudication distance. The more the patient is having a progression of the disease, the distance that he could walk without an effort and without a pain had gradually decreased down to make a rest pain that is done. Now, Shubha, how do you diagnose a rest pain? Or exactly, because some people have various definitions about rest pain. What exactly do you mean by the term rest pain?
It will be distressing if you go by the history and then there's a definition to that. So, it would be like a distressing pain, persistent pain, mostly in the terminal parts, that is the forefoot or the digits. It will be present throughout the day, and it will be exacerbated by this thing, exposure to cold. And dependency might give him benefit in the early stages of rest pain.
Okay, right. Because now, there are multiple.
Yeah. Now, if we are to, put it into the definition of critical limb ischemia, then they say that, which has not been resolved for 2 weeks by continuous medication. But that is
okay,
when we
so this is exactly the point that I was going to come. Right. So this is exactly the point that I was going to come. Now, so I will now take the question in a reverse way, that if we have said that the rest pain is a continuous pain that has been present, say, for a duration of more than 2 weeks, the patient requires a supranormal dose of analgesics, maybe, or maybe has become an opioid addict, is now the patient has a dependency and that relieves partially the pain, but the limb appears a bit cold, as you have said. The pain is always a persistent, dull nature of the pain. Now, Shubha, just an important point to again talk about this one is that examiners will like to ask a very straightforward question, that how could you diagnose this patient has a chronic limb ischemia or chronic ischemia to the limb?
Till so far, we have discussed this kind of history will only be found in a chronic limb ischemia with the claudication distance gradually reducing and not relieved by rest, and then the nature of the pain changing to this, rest pain characteristic, the location in the terminal parts. From the history so far we have discussed, this has to be an arterial pain. Had it been a venous pain, it would have been, a continuous kind of a bursting pain in the calf or a dull aching pain in the calf on walking or standing. It would not come down to the foot. He would not have a decrease in the claudication distance. Had it been a neuralgic pain, he would have mostly, posterolateral distribution, a sharp shooting kind of a pain. Sometimes you can have a claudication pain, but it will not be consistent with the distance. Rather, you would find relief in a specific position, maybe bending down, bending forward, depending on the neurological pathology. And if it had been an acute inflammatory pain, it would not have certainly persisted like this for the last, months or something like that.
Okay, so I feel that what you have mentioned is a very important take home for all, because in an exam, the first question appears a bit simple, whereas it is a bit confusing, that why did you feel it's chronic limb ischemia? Your answer should always be on the side of having a crampy pain, but also to be stressed upon that a venous claudication, so-called claudication, is not a claudication. It is a venous outburst of a pain because of an edema to the tissues and perforators getting distended with blood. There is a neurological type of pain, which is a sharp shooting, and there is cellulitis and musculoskeletal causes, which are of a different nature. So very good. So you have now made it. Now, the next important point is you have used a term called as critical limb ischemia. Before we proceed to the physical examination, what exactly do you mean by the term a critical leg ischemia? Because examiners will like to stress upon that beyond the history of having a rest pain, what do you mean by the term critical leg ischemia, and what is the implication of this term?
See, firstly, I would like to go to the implication of the background of it first, because we need to differentiate chronic limb ischemia from a critical limb ischemia, or nowadays, they are even defining it as critical limb threatening ischemia. We need not add the terminology. We may stick to limb ischemia. The only reason for this is that it is a sign of a warning. The disease has progressed and now it is progressing rapidly. If you just go by the data, a claudicant is expected to remain a claudicant for the next 5 years, 80 out of 100 patients. So 80% will remain claudicant. They're not expected to have a major cardiac event in the next 5 years. The moment the patient turns into a critical limb ischemia, his limb salvage chance over the next 2 years is close to 50%. And of the remaining 50%, the cardiovascular mortality could be as high as 25%.
Okay, so can you repeat? So this 50% of the patients are going to go for an amputation, isn't it?
Is most likely to lose their limb if left unintervened.
Okay, and then you have said that 25%. Now that's a big number. Patients are going to have
a chance of having a major cardiac event, a major cardiovascular event,
right, like an acute myocardial infarction. Right.
So the basic understanding is that, more than the data, is that you have to act quickly, not only to save the limb, but also to decrease the accelerated process of the disease now. So it is more like the mirror of your cardiovascular health. It's just showing up dirt now. So then you have to control the atherosclerotic factors, prevent the major cardiovascular event, as well as target your limb salvage.
Okay, so that's a very important point that you have said. That means that whenever someone is asking, not only is the pain important, the rest of the body, that includes the cardiovascular, maybe the chance of having a cerebrovascular accidents, etc. Some people stress upon the ophthalmological, those amaurosis fugax, and some people talk even of an impotence and these events also. All right. Shubha, how common is this syndrome, commonly asked in an examination, called as Leriches syndrome? Because examiners have been fancy to this term called as Leriches syndrome. How common is this syndrome, and what exactly is this problem called as a Leriches syndrome?
A Leriche syndrome is, I believe, impotence along with the buttock claudication due to iliac occlusion.
Right. So it is right. So is it very common to have the mouth of both the iliac arteries blocked like this?
More than saying that it is common or not, I believe we should know it for a simple reason that it's very difficult, to go and ask someone about the personal history who's come for something else. But we should know it for a simple reason that when we are intervening this patient, there is a chance that we may shut off the iliac due to our intervention. And we should not land up in a medical legal problem later on. So it is better that we know it, no matter how uncommon it is.
All right. So that's a very important point that you have said. Good. So I hope that this point about history taking, we took a long time, is important. So we quickly now jump on to, after you have taken the history and the patient comes with a crampy pain in the leg, plus minus a gangrene, what are the points that you would like to see in this link very quickly? Points to look into the limb, or as I have said, look, feel, move, and sometimes even measure. Okay, so what are the things that you usually look into such a patient who comes with such signs of chronic limb ischemia?
Yeah, firstly, just do not forget the general survey at all. Keep that in mind. Now come to the limb. In the general survey, of course, for the pulse rhythm and the volume, blood pressures has to be taken. This is a cardiovascular patient. Coming to the limb, just have a look at what the skin texture of both the limbs is. This is very important. Whether you are having any signs of chronic stigma of ischemia, that is, the skin has loss of hairs. Typically, it is set below the knee, or below the mid leg, maybe. There's the shiny hairs, brittle nails, easily breakable nails, and whether, most importantly, the one limb looks more wasted than the other limb in your this thing inspection at first when you're looking at the limb.
Okay, so that means the third point that you have mentioned is the girth of the limb, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so then any other particular points to examine? So after the girth, I feel that, okay. So after the girth, I feel that you have seen the skin, you have seen for nails, hair and loss, and you have compared the girth. Now it is time to look into the limb, particularly the digits, for any loss or any evidence of any gangrene. Okay, and if it is a gangrene, then to quantify into a dry gangrene and a wet gangrene or a moist gangrene. The important only point of difference in a dry gangrene is that a dry gangrene, to be understood, has a very well formed line of demarcation. So the line of demarcation is very well discrete, whereas a wet gangrene, the same disease process in a different perspective, the line of demarcation is not only well or not only ill-defined, the basic problem is that the surrounding tissues have signs of a gas-forming organism usually, and there is a crepitus and a tenderness around this region. Okay, both of them will be associated with no amount of, say, both of them will be associated with some amount of numbness or loss of sensation over them. So I feel that, Shubha, any more points to add regarding examination of that gangrenous part of the limb?
Not really.
Okay, good. So now when you go for a palpation or when you like to feel the limb, what are the points that you make sure to feel in the limb?
Always to start off with the superficial palpation for temperature. Again,
Good
as
points.
I said, last day compare with the normal limb and compare all the sectors, the foot with the foot, the leg with the leg, the thigh with the thigh. So,
okay, so I made it a big point. Compare both legs, because this is what all examiners are wanting all candidates to say every time. Very well point set. It's a temperature. Okay, then?
yeah. Then obviously if there's any superficial tenderness or not, and then you can actually divide your palpation into two parts. One is the palpation for the pulses and the other is the palpation for the ulcer or the gangrene, whatever you have in hand.
Okay, right enough. Now, so pulses, as we have said, we'll not be talking about the clinical methods of pulsations. We will be taking a different class on how to palpate the pulses. But I feel that the way to document that in an examination is that either you make a table, and when you make a table, you make a right lower limb, you make a left lower limb, and then say, for example, arteria dorsalis pedis, and then you add your legends in which 3 plus will usually mean a normal volume, a 2 plus a subnormal, a single plus a palpable, a negative is not a palpable pulse. Okay, so this is the way. Shubha, any other better ways to document this part? Arteria dorsalis pedis.
I think for the exam, this is fair enough. Rather than putting
this
sketch diagram which we would do in our OPD, this is better.
So this is the better way. So I feel that, so that means that this is a comprehensive way to tell the examiner that these are the pulses that you have said. But what is important is that please write your legends. And please remember that.
Yeah, and do palpate the upper limb and the carotids as well. You may include it in your general survey, or you can include it here wherever you wish, but do.
So that means that, right. So it is after the lower limb is done, you palpate the upper limb, and after the upper limb is done, you always do the palpation of the carotid. I feel that, yes, this is the way I would like my students to represent in an examination. So that means, as you have very rightly said, in this way, they are not going to forget. That means, please make it a habit that whenever you are writing this for an exam, you write the lower limb and then the upper limb and then the carotid branches. Carotid means palpation of the common carotid bifurcation, the facial artery, pulses minimum to be done. So these are all of, and the superficial temporal. Now, after you have done that, the next important question to talk about it in a limb ischemia is that, so how do you put in a diagnosis or a provisional diagnosis before you talk about the treatment? Now, there are various ways of saying the same thing, but again, it depends upon what is the institute and what is your preference. But I would like my students to say the age of the patient. It is right to better to call as a gentleman rather than a man. So the first one is the age and the gender of the patient. Then the next one to write is the chronic limb ischemia. Though some institutes, you like the term peripheral vascular disease, but on a personal note, I feel that chronic limb ischemia is a more specific entity associated with a gangrene in a limb as a complication, or you may add the word complicated with a gangrene in the limb, and or due to, now the etiology is atherosclerosis or a Buerger's disease clinically. Please remember that both these terms, as Dr. Banerjee has said, the important terms to talk about in Buerger's are multiple diagnosis. So say this one. Some hospitals like you to say, interestingly enough, only this part of the story. Atherosclerosis or Buerger, okay, maybe. But Shubha, as a vascular surgeon, when you write your diagnosis or when you pen down your diagnosis or you need your students to comment upon the diagnosis, what are the points that you think should be mentioned? Beyond these ones or in addition or something to add or deduct in this part?
Not much to add, sir, whether he's a smoker or not. If he's a, I mean, not smoker, if he's a smoker, do mention it. And if he's diabetic or hypertensive, do mention it.
Okay, so I think that very golden word said, if he is a smoker, it is always important to mention that. If he is a diabetic and if he is a hypertensive, these are the things that should be mentioned. I think that yes, this completes a full diagnosis of what should have been. But again, as I have said, it all depends upon what your teachers may like. Some people like only to singly comment upon what is the etiology, what is your diagnosis, atherosclerosis or Buerger. But both of us, Dr. Banerjee and I, feel that the diagnosis should be made in a stepwise manner, in a complete way to state your statement in an examination. Now, coming back to the area that is very less discussed across forums and classes is how do you plan the management? And now this is a point that I'm lucky to have Shubha with me today. Shubha, right? A patient, say for example, a 50-year-old is a smoker. While during a clinical examination, he is inching to smoke and is asking a doctor, can I smoke in the room? And he presents with a rest pain in the right lower limb, which has a dry gangrene of the 4th and the 5th toe. There is a crampy pain in the left lower limb. So the left has a history of a crampy pain. The right lower limb has a dry gangrene of the 4th and the 5th digit. And the patient is a smoker, is a 50-year-old gentleman. So this is the patient profile. And as I've said, there is a rest pain in the right lower limb. So now,
just like to add that you would have the last step. Yeah. If you're going for our own exams, MS or DNB, I think this is fine. If you're going for an MRCS with the diagnosis, an ABI has to be done. So
excellent. No, and Shubha, what is important is that nowadays many centers in MS and DNB also provide. I was going to come exactly to this point, that should they mention the term ABPI in the diagnosis, or should they wait for the examiner to ask about the ABPI? Because this discussion is something that is obviously going to come very quickly. Okay, now please let us go back to this patient.
Yeah. So if I'm going to this patient, obviously I should be clear in my mind is that this patient for the right lower limb needs intervention or some corrective measure. The left lower limb is a claudican, so it will be managed by the medical management. So this is the clarity of my mind, as an examiner. So firstly, I would like to do is an arterial Doppler. I assume that I have done my ABI. So I would like to do an axial Doppler of both the lower limbs to confirm my diagnosis.
Okay. So you are required to confirm your diagnosis, right? And you will require to do a arterial Doppler, right enough?
Yeah. Since he has a bilateral disease, I do a bilateral Doppler.
Right. Now, on this point, sorry for the interruption. Should you be doing an ABPI as a part of your clinical evaluation, or should it be done combined when the patient is undergoing the Doppler study?
For my exam and for my MRCS exam and for my practice in my clinic, if I'm going for a MS or DNB exam, I need to be a little smart. If there is no handheld Doppler, I need not struggle with a stethoscope. I may, mention to my examiner that, sir, I will do an ABPI by this method.
Okay. So that means that now in your clinic, what is the step that you are going to take? So you measure an ABPI, I think, initially, isn't it? Or should you wait for the Doppler and then, or at the same time?
An ABPI is an, independent diagnostic as well as a prognostic thing for limb ischemia. So I do it stat. It's like listening to a heart sound. You do an ABPI stat. That's it, and document it in your OPD sheet or in your exam paper. So ABPI for the right lower limb is this, and for the left lower limb is this.
Right. And now on this one, Shubho, let me ask this one, because ABPI is not something that is measured very frequently. Okay. Say in an examination, there is a handheld Doppler that is given. So how exactly is the ABPI measured?
Okay.
In an examination scenario.
Right. Just let me take your patient as an example. You have a right lower limb gangrene, left lower limb claudication. Left lower limb, the femoral and the popliteals are palpable. Below knee, they are not palpable. Right lower limb femoral is palpable. Below femoral, nothing is palpable. Upper limbs, brachial radials are palpable. This is, what I assume for the patient. Now, what I do is that I take the BP cuff and I take the systolic blood pressure of the right lower limb. I tie the cuff as close to the ankle as possible on the calf. I tie it on the calf prominence, and I take the signals, that is the systolic BP where my signal muffles down, on both the vessels, that is the anterior tibial and the posterior tibial.
Okay, just wait a minute, please.
The higher pressure now.
Right. So, say for example, this is the anterior tibial, and this is the posterior tibial. Okay, so which artery should be selected for measuring the blood pressure?
Sir, I have to put my handheld Doppler probe on both and measure the systolic pressure of both, and I have to take the one which is good or better of the two.
Okay, that means the benefit of doubt.
Yeah.
Right. The better marks in which paper? Okay, so it is paper 1 and paper 2. Right, I get that. Okay. So now you measure, right. And this is the systolic pressure, I think?
That's the systolic pressure, yeah.
Okay. So that's the systolic pressure at the ankle. Right. And
now I do the same for brachial.
Yes. For the?
Brachial.
For the brachial artery. Okay. Is the blood pressure cuff different or is it the same cuff?
Should be different, but we have to manage with the same one.
Okay, right. So definitely, probably the atrophy of the limb helps you in this regard, I hope. Okay, right. So now this is the measurement that you do. So now, after you have measured these two entities, that means you are going to go for the ankle brachial. That means you are going to add or you are going to divide the ankle by the brachial. Okay. Now, the normal range is something that every undergraduate student even knows, should be somewhere between 0.9 to 1.1, I hope.
Yeah,
or around 1.
Close to 1 is good enough, because the moment it goes a little close to 1.4 and more, it's not so good.
Okay, that means this is a scenario that calls for a calcification in the arteries or an hardening of the arteries, particularly seen in diabetes. Let us talk of the story from below down. So when do you term, or at what range will you term it as a limb ischemia only?
Lesser than 0.9.
Okay, so that means lesser than 0.9. And what is the upper limit of that?
Okay, so the lower limit. See, the lower limit actually...
So the lower limit of that, sorry.
The critical ischemia is less than 0.4. So,
okay, so that means...
defined.
Right. So that means up till 0.5, you diagnose it as a limb ischemia. Critical limb ischemia is something in which the story starts at 0.4. Important words. And as Dr. Banerjee has mentioned, the word critical is the critical thing in a critical limb ischemia is that the patient is going to lose not only his limb, but also his life. So probably the important point to understand that part is this area, that the critical ischemias are 0.4 or less. Okay, so this is a very valuable point as you have said. And as you have said that this patient who is 50-year-old, he has an ABPI that is measured in the right limb as well as the lower limb, and the right limb obviously has a 0.4 or less. Left lower limb will have it more. Okay, so this is the first step that you did in your clinic that you did, and then you followed up with a Doppler evaluation. Okay, right. Shubha, the patient is screaming in pain. The doc, can you give me something for pain? So what is the analgesic that you give to this patient to decrease his rest pain?
I would just, follow the pattern, this WHO pattern, where you start from the basic paracetamol, preferably avoid the NSAIDs, go into tramadol, and try multimodal, analgesia till the time you figure it out his treatment, because this is just to support him. That's it. So I'm not, this analgesic is not of a choice. It's just the WHO is rightly a WHO pain ladder with multimodal analgesia to support him. That's it.
Okay, right. Now, another question that is obviously asked sometimes even by the patients and sometimes by my surgical colleagues is that two of these limbs are having a dry gangrene. So the patient is waiting for a Doppler. So when do you plan for doing an amputation in these two fingers? These are a dry gangrene with a very clear-cut line of demarcation.
No amputation. Till you have not understood how much is the ischemia and you have not corrected it or attempted to correct it, we are not going to amputate it for a dry gangrene.
Okay. But say, for example, this patient in a similar note is a diabetic patient with a moist gangrene or a wet gangrene. So do you plan for an amputation or do you plan for a wide debridement?
I would firstly manage with antibiotics and drainage. If it halts, the sepsis component halts good enough. If there is evidence of systemic sepsis or spreading cellulitis, I'll just do a minimum, what replicates a guillotine kind of a thing, a minimum debridement to drain off the pus. That's it. Because the bigger wound you create, the more problem you are landing up with an ischemic limb.
So this I'm talking very
before assessing or before even revascularizing.
Right. Because you have not yet done the Doppler.
Right.
So please remember that you could not do the Doppler yet, and we are talking about a scenario in which this patient is still in your clinic and he's asking you to, doctor, do something for the pain, do something for the leg, and then you are pressed to do something for the leg and this. And in an examination also, if someone is asking you, probably this is a better way to think about that, sir. In the clinic, I do an ABPI and assess the severity of the ischemia. If the patient is having pain, he is coming with a rest pain, analgesics as per the WHO ladder, and then an amputation for a dry gangrene can still wait, as he has said, till you assess the final vascularity of this. Now, Shubha, when a general surgeon is asking for a color Doppler, what are the things that he should be seeing for?
Yeah.
Or what are the things that he should be looking for?
Yeah. So firstly, he should be looking for the arteries involved, the length, the severity, that whether it's an occlusion or a stenosis.
Okay, so length, occlusion versus stenosis. Okay.
And whether it is a multi-segment disease or whether it is affecting a single stretch of artery.
Okay, right enough. Now, so once we have seen in the color Doppler, length, occlusion versus stenosis. Now, an important thing that I always feel to ask about is that what is the difference between an occlusion versus stenosis? Or what is the technical terminology that defines the stenosis?
The stenosis is a narrowing. for it to be
Okay.
hemodynamically significant for an artery, it should usually involve more than 50% of the luminal diameter of the adjacent artery. That is a significant stenosis. Otherwise, a stenosis is simply a narrowing. And an occlusion is an occlusion, it's a blockage. So it's completely choked up.
Okay, so an occlusion on the other hand is a complete blockage in this one. So this is a very important term that he has said, and this is very importantly term. That means it is always obvious that when the patient has an occlusion, all the blood supply in the distal tissues are going through the collaterals. Can you get to see those collaterals on a Doppler?
A very experienced ultrasound sonologist will give you an idea of the major collateral. For example, he'll comment on the profunda, few genicular collaterals and all. But if you want to have a roadmap, you need something else.
Okay, that means a Doppler is the first, say, the idea that gives you. Okay, right. And then you have said about segment. Now, when you say about the segment, that means you are meaning the anatomical area, isn't it? Right. Okay, now anatomical area means in the lower limb, you can see from the foot or the pedal arteries. I am very happy. You can accurately comment. You can see the popliteal arteries. Okay. Now, when it comes to the femoral area, I think that you can see at the groin, the common femoral artery. Right. So the common femoral artery can be commented, I feel. Shubha, what is your what is the role of this Doppler in making us understand the pathology or the problems with the profunda femoral arteries? Because the profunda femoris is a very deep-seated artery. So does the Doppler pick that up?
No. So when we are looking, see the profunda artery after having its first major branch will terminate into most of the muscular branches. What you need to pick up on a Doppler is that what is the mouth or the opening of the profunda artery looking like, and whether there is a bifurcational plaque at the common femoral artery and the profunda artery, this thing, bifurcation or not, because that changes your treatment perspective. So when we are
doing so that is the point that I was right.
Yeah, what we ideally look is from above downwards. We can see a bit of the external iliac. If it's a very lean and thin patient, you can obviously see the common iliac and all, but we assume these will be quite obese patient and, at least overweight patients. So let's say we see the external iliac, the common femoral, the superficial femoral, the mouth of the profunda femoris. We see the popliteal vessel. The below knee vessels can be partly hidden behind the bones. So we see the proximal, mid, and the distal ATA. And similarly, we see the proximal, mid, and the distal PTA. Peroneal, only a very trained radiologist will find out. Foot arteries are usually very difficult to find out on a good Doppler. So we stop at the dorsalis pedis thereby. Now, if we are looking at a blockage, and if we have, said that the mid-femoral artery is blocked, so what you will find is that in the external iliac and the common iliac, it's a good triphasic flow. The graph goes up, comes down a little below the baseline, and then has a small notch up. So that's a triphasic flow. You will see the block. Just proximal to the block, you will find a huge thump, but the triphasicity will be lost. So it's like a very high velocity kind of a thing. After the block, you will find a dampened flow. So it's the peak has gone down, the triphasicity is not there, and depending upon the severity of the block, you will find either a biphasic flow or you will find a monophasic, just a venous kind of a flow, an undulating flow on a Doppler, distal to the block. And on the other hand, if you have a stenosis, you will have similar thing, just that you will have a very high velocity or a turbulence at the area and a little proximal to the stenosis. In a block, you'll have nothing there. And in a stenosis, you'll have a turbulence or a peak velocity very high at the area and just proximal to the stenosis. So this is how it would grossly look on a Doppler. So you've drawn it very correctly.
So this is just in this point, is this thing, because this graphs that I have made after the block or the stenosis, is what is called as a distal runoff?
This is, a distal, this runoff means where the vessel goes. We will use it more for a angiography finding rather than a Doppler, but loosely, yes, an idea about the distal vessels.
Okay, so but definitely it is much better seen on an angiogram, which gives you an accurate roadmap rather than this being a poor man's angiogram, you may say. Okay, right. So this is all about this one. Now, based on the Doppler, okay, so you have seen the Doppler, this patient has a block in the, or a stenosis or an occlusion in the superficial femoral. And so let me draw the arterial anatomy for you. So that means this is the arterial anatomy. Okay. This is the left side, the popliteal trifurcation. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember that vascular surgeons consider that the popliteal artery trifurcates. Anatomists do not agree to that, but we surgeons agree to that one. And say, for example, this patient, this is the anatomy, and this is the picture about this. This is the Doppler anatomy, or the impression that we have after the Doppler. Okay. Now, Shubho, this is the Doppler anatomy. This is a triphasic signal. I have written a TP. This is a biphasic, but as you have very rightly commented, the amplitude has gone up. Okay. This is a triphasic, but at this point, it has become biphasic. So these are all monophasic. Okay. And this one. So this is what the Doppler gentleman has given us a picture. He has been drawing pictures, and then we are really impressed by his picture. Right. Now, what is your plan now?
So depending on this thing, what you call this Doppler finding, I will require to do a peripheral angiogram, because that will be my gold standard. And depending on the angiography, I will either do an on-table endovascular recanalization, or I will plan for a surgical bypass. This is my vascular treatment at the back of my mind. For an examiner, I have to be aware that I have to tell him about my patient preparation, that is the basic blood test, the renal function, because I am planning an angiography for the patient, a basic cardiovascular checkup in the form of ECG and a basic 2D echocardiography, because do not rule out the chances of a chronic thrombus, so a cardiac function as well as to look for any thrombus, and an X-ray of the foot, because you have already mentioned that there is a gangrene. So at the back of my mind, this has to be there apart from my vascular plan.
Right. In this point, an important question is that by the time the Doppler has been done, you are advising for an angiogram. The patient is still smoking cigarettes, and definitely we will be thinking about something on lifestyle modifications. Okay, right. So at what point, rather, because one point is on lifestyle modification is to stop smoking. But what is very important is that by the time the patient comes to us in the first visit only, is apart from the smoking issue, important things to note are, so the smoking is to be stopped. Now in this one, I heard one of the examiners ask an important question. So when the patient has stopped smoking, do you advise the patient to take some nicotine chewing gums or some nicotine patch?
So I don't think it's my job to suggest him. There's a good smoking cessation program. So I would ideally refer him to the person, because there are, again, there are 5 A's to it. You have to first assess his dependency. Then you have to see that what is his addiction level. You have to see how much is his, anatomic reliability on nicotine. And then you have to advise him, and you have to, as well as, counsel him about the smoking cessation. So just
I feel that
like a paracetamol is not good enough.
So I feel that that's a very, very apt answer to what should have been the best answer. Good one. Now, talking about drugs, okay. At the first visit, as you have diagnosed a chronic limb ischemia, what are the medications to be started?
And if I come to a real life scenario, so what I have to do is that this is my patient. I have to tell him to stop smoking. I have to tell him to control his blood sugars, to control his blood pressure, take lipid lowering agents, be it statins most commonly used, start him on a single antiplatelet. Please keep in mind, all the students, that the single antiplatelet is not going to open up his arteries. It's not going to improve his limb perfusion. It's not going to do anything with the leg. It's just going to decrease his, chances of cardiovascular events. That's about it. So start him on a
Okay, can you kindly repeat that? Okay, can you kindly repeat that, Shubha? Because that's so important a point that I need everyone to hear it once again. Okay.
Yeah. So any single any antiplatelet agents which are given in a peripheral arterial occlusive disease patient is to, prevent the major side effects of atherosclerosis. When we mean major side effects, we mean only three major side effects. Those are cardiac events, cerebrovascular events, and death. So this is done only to prevent these three major side effects of atherosclerotic disease. It is not going to help you in the short term. It's not going to help you in terms of limb perfusion. We may think that giving 2 blood thinners will improve limb perfusion. It doesn't happen that way. Or at least the studies do not suggest that. It may happen, but studies do not suggest. The studies suggest it is to decrease cardiovascular events. So you start with an antiplatelet, ideally a single antiplatelet. Ecosprin is good enough. There have been again studies, like Charisma, and there have been other studies which have stated that dual antiplatelets combining aspirin with clopidogrel do have better cardioprotective effect. At the same time, they have higher chances of bleeding. So the consensus is, in general, start off with a single antiplatelet.
Okay, right. So for an examination purpose, I think that students should be talking about single antiplatelet drugs to start with. Good points. So beyond this lifestyle modification, now your patient tells me, okay, doctor, I am doing everything. You have told me to start walking, brisk walking to develop my collaterals. I have stopped smoking.
Really. If it's a critical limb ischemia, sir, I'm discussing his right leg. No role for walking, no role for silastazole, no role for pentoxifylline, this, that. If he chooses that pathway from someone else, God helps him.
That okay, that's the important point. Why don't you encourage then walking in a patient who already has a gangrene or a limb ischemia? Because that is an important question that I've seen some examiners ask also. Because walking is a very common exercise that is given to patients with a cardiovascular disease. Okay, right.
If this gentleman had come with, similar disease like he had on the left leg, my whole idea would have, if you just give me a mirror image of the right leg as the left leg, my whole idea would have changed and I would have gone that pathway. That, start these medications, start off with silastazole, there is something known as a structured exercise program for claudican. So start off with that, which basically stresses on your cardiovascular treadmill exercises, walking, supervised walking, so that you develop your collaterals and all those stuff. So as I said earlier, a claudican gives you time. He is remaining stable 80% for the next 5 years. So he's not an advanced disease. In a rest pain or a gangrene, your tissue is lost. So you are having a very advanced disease. So you have to intervene and salvage his limb first, as well as do all this stuff. So no role for medical management apart from controlling his atherosclerotic risk factors. No role for silastazole, pentoxifylline, walking in a critical limb ischemia. Nothing.
Excellent. Okay, so I think that this is a very important point, that or a concept that many people really need to change and understand. Now, coming back to the angiogram that we were discussing about, so your Doppler has told you a picture that yes, that there appears to be a stenosis in the common femoral, the superficial femoral artery in the middle of the thigh. Now, if there is a common femoral artery stenosis that he has been able to say, and the length of the stenosis, say for example, he measures it as a 1 centimeter length of the stenosis. Okay. So now what is the angiogram that you plan, and thereafter what is the next route?
For all the examinees, I think get one calculation very clear. Don't stick adamant to it. People may differ. If you have femoral pulses palpable, you do a DSA or a digital subtraction angiography, or what you say a conventional peripheral angiography. If you do not have a femoral pulse palpable, then you do a CT angiography. Simply because you have a good roadmap of the iliacs and you can plan your intervention accordingly. If the femoral are not palpable. If the femoral are palpable, you do an angiography, and on table you can do an endovascular procedure. The catch to this is that there may be a group of examiner who may still think that if the femorals are palpable, you should go ahead with a CT angiography because it gives you a roadmap, it gives you a planning for your intervention. Better not to argue, but say yes, we will do a CT angiography because it's a non-invasive procedure. The ideal answer is femoral palpable, do a peripheral or a DSA and proceed with your endovascular if feasible. Femoral not palpable, do a CT angiography, plan according to your angiography.
Okay. Shubha, just a small query. When to do an MR angiogram?
So it's very difficult to interpret an MR angiogram everywhere. The only answer would be if the creatinine levels are raised, and I'm looking for an MR angiogram.
Okay, that bad kidneys.
Yeah, right.
Bad kidneys maybe. Okay, the only maybe the indication. So CT angiograms give you a much better anatomical delineation on that. Okay, now, so when you talk about this say superficial femoral stenosis, so if this is what is the superficial stenosis, and you have seen or you have done a DSA, and it shows you that yes, there is this anatomy, and along with that, well, I'm not a vascular guy, Shubha, so excuse any mistakes that I may be doing. So, okay, so that it also shows you 2 or 3 collaterals. So now at this point, when it shows this, and then what is your take or what is your plan now? You have done a DSA from the femoral artery at the groin.
I think so. The dye. Examination, I'll keep it very simple. If it's a short segment stenosis, when I mean a short segment, roughly 1 centimeter, though these do not hold good these days, but roughly if it's a short, so I would never say 1 centimeter in my exam. I would say if it's a short segment, single segment stenotic lesion, I will do an endovascular procedure, balloon angioplasty. A stent should not come out of my mind in an exam. If it's a long segment or a multi-segment disease or an occlusive disease, I will do a femoropopliteal bypass. I will prefer a native conduit in the form of a reverse saphenous graft. So I will like to keep it simple for my exam.
So that means when do you consider a bypass, a femoropopliteal bypass, in which condition? So number one, as you have said, a long segment. That means that by a long segment, we mean maybe something more than one, or you have said it's an occlusive disease, okay,
or a
multi-segment single artery disease, right? So multi-segment single artery disease, right enough. So these are the conditions that will promote you to go for something called as a femoropopliteal bypass. And as you have very rightly said, what is the conduit that you said?
So it's a native conduit, a reverse great saphenous or a long saphenous.
Okay, reverse great saphenous or the long saphenous vein. Right. So this is, I feel, as you have said, the best answer that would have been possible for an DNB or an MS appearing candidate or an exit examination appearing candidate for an exam. I really feel that there is a good answer to this one. Okay. Now, when the femoral is not palpable and you did a CT angio, any change in the plans that happen?
Oh yes, sir. It will take a day to discuss that because you are talking of aorta.
Okay. Exactly. So that means that any kinds of any grading that is the transatlantic classification, in which time do you require that one?
That is basically when we have an angiographic image in hand, and it caters to all the levels. It caters to the aortoiliac as well as the FEMPOP level. So once we have the angiography, the things that we have put down loosely as, short, long segment, multifocal occlusive stenosis, it's a scientific, aggregation of all that. The TAC classification.
Okay, so the transatlantic classification. Okay. So I feel that this is what is the important. Now, as we again come back to that patient, this patient is still asking a doctor, okay, so you did a good endovascular procedure. What is your plan for my digits? Those digits are still black.
Yeah.
There is a dry gangrene. So should we consider an amputation at this time after the revascularization?
Yeah, once after the revascularization, you have documented that his ABI has, once you revascularize, there are a few things which are asked usually in a vascular exam. What were the signs of a successful revascularization? Now, for a
Very good
general
question.
exam, I would just put it very loosely that post-operatively or even per-operatively, I will look for a distal palpable ankle pulse. On a handheld Doppler, I will have good triphasic signals, and his ABPI should improve what was in the pre-op levels, and it usually jumps to as high as more than 0.15. Usually, it's not a cutoff, but it usually jumps to as high as that. And if you are giving a very good answer, do mention that I will have a transcutaneous partial pressure of oxygen before and after the procedure. And once I'm sure that it has gone more than 40, I will amputate from the suitable level.
Okay.
Loosely, we give it a time of about a week's time beyond, between which all this happens usually.
Okay, right enough. Okay, right. So just one simple question, because you see examiners will be having their own set of interesting questions.
Right.
Some examiner once asked that if you put say a pulse oximeter in the limb after the revascularization, so does a pulse oximeter in any way help you in understanding a good successful revascularization? Because last year, I think that every household in the world knows what a pulse oximeter is.
What a pulse oximeter is. If you have a pulse oximeter connected to a multi-channel monitor, it is a jugaad technique for all the other things that I have said. So the SpO2 is expected to go up maybe close to 95, and you'll have a good waveform on the pulse oximeter. So
right.
Obviously, no standard books have described that, but we are used to working in compromise scenarios, so these would be good indicators. Yes, good. I will not answer this in my exam.
No, but examiners will be asking you. You see.
Yeah.
Okay, because these questions will be coming. So I think that this is a very comprehensive way in which we discussed today. We shoot up by around 10 minutes time excess. More or less, ladies and gentlemen, we have tried, both of us have tried to discuss and take you through the case completely, except for the clinical methods for which we'll be discussing a day. We have not talked about any particular treatment for any particular disease like Berger's disease, etc. Because this discussion today was on chronic limb ischemia to complete. So that means that we really like to thank my colleague, Dr. Shubhabrata Banerjee, for his very, very important inputs and a learning session. So
I keep learning every day when I discuss with you.
Okay, right. Right. I would like to take questions from the audience, and then I have a couple of questions on Berger's disease. Right. Okay. Your questions, please, ladies and gentlemen, that you have.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, the loss of hair on the limbs, clinically, loss of hair or brittle nails are attributed to chronic arterial disease.
Yes.
How common are they in venous disease, sir? Because as thus mentions that loss of hair and brittle nails can also be seen in venous disease also. So I would like sir to give his insights on that.
Okay. Show opinions and then.
Yeah. They may be very common, but when you look at a limb which is looking, malnourished, atrophied, with loss of fat, loss of that skin shininess, and with loss of hair and brittleness, it's almost skin and bones, then it is certainly a chronic limb ischemia. It's deprived of its blood supply. On the other side, you see a thickened limb, fat, stout, distended limb, with maybe loss of hairs, as you have said, with lots of pigments and other stigma of venous disease. It's certainly a venous limb. So these are signs which are associated with the disease process, but you just cannot say that loss of hair means it's a limb ischemia, loss of nail means it's a venous disease. It's not like that. You have to take it as a whole.
Okay. Right. Just fully one point to make. See, in an arterial disease, the basic story is a story of malnutrition. As I've told you at the beginning, the river is now dried up. That's it.
Right.
The fat is lost. The skin is stretched over the bone. The hair is lost because the hair doesn't get some food to grow. Now, when you talk about a nail, okay, the problem in this nail is that that this nail is a very rapidly developing keratin, and one day it does get a nutrition, it is pink. Another day it doesn't get a nutrition, it has a white tinge. Another day it again has a white tinge because it doesn't get a nutrition. And then what happens is that the quality of the keratin has gone down. A very small trauma can produce a fracture in this one, and obviously the nail is said to be brittle. And now in a venous disease, the problem is not about not getting food. The problem is that the food truck should have gone away, but there is too much amount of blood in that, and the tissues are congested. So nails technically do not become brittle or fragile in a case of a venous disease until and unless the distal tissue edema produces such amount of subcutaneous fibrosis that it produces an dermal ischemia. But again, remember that that is not responsible for a pulp ischemia. And talking about skins getting shiny, again the same logic. If there is a dermal ischemia, particularly in the pretibial region, that area there is an atrophy due to lipodermatosclerosis that makes the skin much prominent. Okay, right.
Thank you so much.
Any more queries, please? Right? Okay, no more. Shubha, just to conclude, in Burchard's disease, we got to hear about a lot of interesting treatments, starting from omentum that was used to be brought, and there was a big generation of surgeons who were trained in bringing the omentum from the abdomen, understanding the epiploic arcades, and then making epiploic arcades and then arches, and then bringing them down to the ankle joint. I really found it magical rather than having any scientific logic. What is your take on an omentoplasty in a Burgess disease?
No take, sir. I have no idea about it.
Oh, well. See, this is exactly happens. Well, this is more of a magic and a myth than happens. Okay. Now, the next technique.
Because to do such beautiful surgeries, but one must understand that Burgess is a very aggressive vasculitic disease. So it is affecting your, target vessels, the veins, and it's skipping here and there. So it is better off that you manage medically and you manage your local tissue destruction with this thing, local wound care. And you may try a little bit of other drugs, prostaglandins, which have got some effect. It is better that you don't, put your neck to that patient unless it is absolutely needed.
Okay, any role for pentoxifylline? Because these are all technical questions that are asked across India or the Indian subcontinent, maybe in this perspective. In a Burgess disease, any role of pentoxifylline? Pentoxifylline, ladies and gentlemen, is a drug that decreases the viscosity, acts on the phosphodiesterase receptors 3 and 5, is said to prevent the Rulu formation. But again, as Dr. Banerjee has said, there is a big question mark.
It's a big question.
Okay, the third trick is a big question mark, obviously, because as he has said very rightly, Burgess is a skip disease, like Crohn's is a skip disease of gut. Burgess is a skip disease of medium and small sized vessel. Okay, what about the role of a Ilizarov technique? Again, these things have been discussed.
I don't know of any scientific evidence of Ilizarov specifically.
Exactly. So again, there is a very difficult notion about talking about beyond case reports and experiences about what is the role of doing an Ilizarov in a Burgess disease, because the series that have been used, particularly in Ilizarov for upper limb and lower limb, some people have always said that the Ilizarov helps, but there is no tenable evidence to be said during an examination. And the fourth one, Shubha, is the most important one. There was again a generation of surgeons who felt that doing a sympathectomy, particularly in a Burgess disease, is associated or was done for treatment of a rest pain. What is your take on this point? Lumbar sympathectomy.
Firstly, lumbar sympathectomy these days are mostly done, by minimal invasive techniques or interventional techniques. You do it mostly a chemical lumbar sympathectomy rather than a surgical lumbar sympathectomy by either using absolute alcohol or other agents that you have. It is a short-term stopgap thing that you can do if a patient is having rest pain or minor tissue loss in a non-reconstructible vascular disease. You have no other opinions here. You have no other options. You have exhausted your medical this thing. medical therapies, and then you can use it as a last resort, but this is not a treatment. This will just increase your cutaneous perfusion, give some degree of respite to the terminal rest pain and minor tissue losses, if any of these. So that's okay. There is definitely a role for non-reconstructible disease. Yes.
Right. So I feel that
a palliative kind of role. Yeah.
Right. So it is technically can be said to be a palliation, but believe me, the palliation. But the problem is that if you go for lumbar sympathectomy in the other limb, which was having claudication, that is like writing somewhat as a death sentence for that limb.
Absolutely.
Whatever blood that limb was getting to that muscle, you have diverted that blood to the skin. So if that limb was in a state of claudication, you are more or less sure to progress that limb to a state of a permanent occlusion or to a state of critical limb ischemia. So that is the reason lumbar sympathectomy
is mostly in use nowadays for non-reconstructible vascular disease, and there are few Indian papers also related to it, is prostaglandin E1. This drug has been given in an IV or an intra-arterial form for 5 days a week. They say you give it for around 6 months for a non-reconstructible vascular disease. And it has shown some promise, at least in terms of, again, minor tissue loss and rest pain. The only side effect is that you do not give it to patients who have a weak heart. And so you have to have a basic cardiac assessment. But again, these are not frontline treatments. These are treatments for non-reconstructible disease. So you are not able to...
Maybe as a palliation, I think. Right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. So I think that, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a long discussion. Both of us have tried to discuss, more or less, we have tried to touch on all aspects of a huge topic. So with this, any more questions or queries on? Okay.
Hello, sir.
Right. Yeah.
Sir, what is the present take of usage of beta blockers in the management of PVD?
Right.
Not a
good question.
Not a primary drug.
Now, if you are mentioning beta blockers, that means, see, beta blockers again will always have a very debatable role, doctor. If you are using beta blockers, because remember that peripheral vasodilatation is done by the beta 2 receptors. So you need some amount of peripheral vasodilatation. And again, that peripheral vasodilatation is more on the cutaneous arteries rather than the muscular arteries. So the basic idea of a beta blocker can again have a double-edged sword-like concept. On one side, you are trying to have some amount of blood to the muscles. On another side, the heart that may have been weak due to an ischemia may again have more of a problem than this. So beta blockers, I feel I will be thinking about 10 times before using a beta blockers in a limb.
Sir, presently they say that nebivolol and carvedilol can be used, but then there is no class 1 evidence for that.
Absolutely. That is the reason, doctor. You see, that is the reason, because all these drugs, apart from, you may say, aspirin, clopidogrel, and naftidoforil, these drugs don't have a class 1 evidence for use in an established limb ischemia. Okay, right. Shubha, any additional points to make on this one?
No, sir. No.
Okay. Sir, right.
Sir, one more doubt, sir.
Right,
sir,
right,
in monophasic waveform, sir, because radiology textbooks mention that there is loss of diastolic, the wave in that, and surgical textbooks in some places they mention there is loss of systolic upstroke. So what do we go ahead with? Is it the loss of systole or the loss of diastole?
If you see a monophasic waveform, it's just like small ripples on the ultrasound. So I don't think you have to go much into the details of whether it's a diastolic upstroke or the systolic upstroke. It's just small ripples if you see. So once you see, you'll understand that.
Okay, now, so if you have asked me, that means right on this point, I will be preferring more of a systolic answer rather than a diastolic, because if you see the triphasic 3 waves, the very basic part of the first part of the component, or the first wave component, is always the systolic upstroke in the pulse. The second one is the reverberation of that, and that will be occurring during the diastole. And the third component will be the elasticity of the blood vessel. So if you're thinking of that triphasic waveform, replicated to a monophasic or downscaled to a monophasic one, then probably I will be thinking of that as a systolic push of the blood. Now, doctor, these terms of this diastolic and this systolic components are basically reflected when you have a cardiac output and you are trying to correlate the peripheral pulse dicrotic notches along with the cardiac impulses. But when it comes to a limb or sorry, when it comes to an artery that is occluded, remember that majority of the pressure front is already blocked. So it can be a diastolic or a systolic, as Dr. Banerjee has said. Whatever is trickling down in the diastolic or the systolic, definitely the diastolic will have a lesser pressure. That small waveform will be seen in a monophasic.
Yeah, actually, so if we go into the technical detail of it, what happens is that you're seeing an artery. What happens? It gets a systolic blood supply. It has an up form. Then it goes down because the systolic pump has gone down. Now the diastolic elasticity takes over and it compresses a little bit forward again. And so you have a diastolic notch again, the third notch, the triphasic notch. When you're looking at a distal pulse, depending on the amount of blood you are getting through the collateral, it is mimicking an inflow, but it does not have any, straight line connection with the heart. It does not have those systolic physicity to which your elastic wall of the aorta will, the blood vessel will react. So it's just a filling from the collateral. If you have a very good collateral, you'll have a good amount of pressure head coming. So you'll have a good amount of upstroke. So you will have a kind of a biphasic flow. If you have tricklish collateral, you will have very little amount of blood coming. So the pressure head will be very low and you will have a monophasic kind of a blood flow. But you will lose your diastolic this thing because the elasticity of the blood vessel need not respond now. Rather, due to the autoregulation, it's trying to dilate and, pull in more amount of blood. So you'll not have the diastolic upstroke. So that is lost both in biphasic and monophasic flow. The bi and mono will now depend upon the amount of pressure head that you are receiving. So, that will kind of explain your biphasic and monophasic flows. For a surgery resident, if you're going for an exam, I think it's good enough that you know that the upstroke is lower and there's loss of the diastolic resistance. That's it.
Yes, thank you, sir. Sir, one more question, sir. If in exams they ask us what is the recent guidelines that we'll have to follow the 2020 guidelines, what do we mention, sir? Is it the ACA or the NICE guidelines, sir?
This is with regards to?
Sir, with regards to the management of PVD, sir.
We're not using ACA or NICE guidelines. I think for your exam, depending on angiography task should be good enough. If you want to know really advanced thing, you have to read up the net for something known as a global vascular guideline nowadays, a GVG guideline. So that incorporates our whole class that we have discussed, the patient criteria, the angiographic findings, the comorbid status and everything. So if you're really looking for recent updates, look up the net for GVG guidelines, the global vascular guidelines for peripheral vascular. Otherwise, for an exam, I think still the task will hold.
Okay, sir. Thank you.